Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Levin, and I'm a steering committee member of CJPIP, the Committee for a Just Peace in Israel and Palestine, which is a community-based organization that has been organizing activities for 25 years to promote a just and lasting peace in Israel-Palestine. Thank you to our guests and all of our listeners and viewers for joining us for a program we have entitled Facing Apartheid in Israel-Palestine. The CJPIC Steering Committee acknowledge our own land's history of genocidal settler colonialism. We live now on the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples. The Council of Three Fires, a confederation of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, Fox, Kickapoo, and Illinois nations were caretakers of this land for centuries before their oppression by European colonists, who committed the crimes of war, forced relocation, taking indigenous children from their families and placing them in assimilationist boarding schools, and other tools of white supremacy. Today, the Chicago area is home to members of 150 indigenous nations. We abhor the ongoing structures of colonialism and white supremacy, and commit ourselves to the ongoing effort to name, illuminate, and deconstruct these structures. For today's program, Facing Apartheid in Israel-Palestine, we'll start with some questions that CJPIP wanted to ask to lay the groundwork. And then we are eager to take your questions. So please submit them via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen at any time. And Janet Settle will organize them and we will use them in the latter part of the webinar. This presentation is being recorded and it will be available on CJPIP's YouTube site within a few days. We will email the link for the recording to everyone who is registered for the event. For many years, Israel and its allies have been able to sustain a false narrative that has successfully shaped mainstream political discourse and served to shield Israel from accountability from its continuing violations of international laws and human rights. This illusion seeks to present Israel to the world as a liberal democracy that is maintaining a temporary military occupation in East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. Two recent reports issued earlier this year, one by B'Tselem and the other by Human Rights Watch, tear away at this illusion, as have other reports by Palestinian researchers and analysts. And many of you are probably familiar with President Jimmy Carter's 2006 book that characterized the occupied territories as an example of apartheid. But B'Tselem's report does not just focus on the occupied territories. It analyzes the Israeli regime as a whole. The significance of B'Tselem's report cannot be overstated. B'Tselem is one of Israel's most important human rights monitoring organizations. And the report meticulously demonstrates that there are not two parallel regimes, a liberal democracy inside the state of Israel, and an outside repressive military regime in the occupied territory. Rather, there is a single regime covering the entire area and the people in it, based on the single organizing principle of apartheid. To discuss the issue of apartheid in Israel-Palestine, we are delighted to have joining us from Jerusalem, Hagai El-Ad and Inès Abdel Razek. Hagai El-Ad is the executive director of the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in Palestinian Territories. Previously, he was the director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and the Jerusalem Open House for Pride and Tolerance. In 2014, Hagai was among foreign policy's 100 leading global thinkers. In 2016 and again in 2018, he spoke before the United Nations Security Council, calling for international action in order to end the occupation. Hagai holds a Master's of Science in Astrophysics from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and was a pre-doctoral fellow at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Inès Abdel Razek is the Advocacy Director of the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, a Palestinian independent organization based in Ramallah. Prior to joining the Institute in 2019, Inès held advisory positions for high-level officials at the Union for the Mediterranean in Barcelona, the UN Environment Programme Executive Office in Nairobi, and the Palestinian Prime Minister's Office in Ramallah, mainly working on multilateral governance and development cooperation policies. Inès is also a policy member at the think tank Al-Shabaka and board member of the social enterprise BuildPalestine. Inès holds a master's degree in public affairs from Sciences Po Paris. I'd like to begin by asking you, Hagai, what led B'Tselem to define what exists across all of Israel-Palestine as apartheid?
Okay, just give me a thumbs up that the audio is okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. I just wanted to be sure. And thank you for this introduction and for taking the initiative to convene us this evening. And thank you for everyone that has joined us. I guess the short answer to that excellent question is what has led us to this conclusion is reality itself, nothing more, nothing less. But I think with that in mind, with B'Tselem's history, it's good perhaps to take a step back and just like to put this in some context. We were founded back in 1989. So think about the days of the first Intifada, late 1980s. And at that point in time, one of the things that we believed in was that what we're dealing with is a temporary situation. And with that in mind, we had a singular mandate, which focused only on the reality on the other side of the Green Line in the occupied territories. And that, if you go on the B'Tselem website or look at B'Tselem reports, then you will see that the entire body of our work has always focused on what is human rights violations in those areas. And we've never said anything about the situation inside Israel proper. But obviously, as time has passed, and that in and of itself has been 3 decades, which is on top of the previous approximately 2 decades since 1967, and that comes on top of the 19 years before between 48 and 67, between the founding of the state and the occupation of the Palestinian territories. And with the passage of time, more and more facts have accumulated, and they've impacted our thinking. And you could have seen that in the shifting language, I would say the developing language that we've used. So from talking about a temporary occupation, to talking about a prolonged occupation, and then talking about a one-state reality in more recent years. But somehow, eventually, we felt that all these different ways of describing reality are insufficient in actually explaining to ourselves first and to the world what is it that we're actually facing. Because to continue to only analyze the situation in the occupied territories while ignoring the rest of the area Israel controls actually works to reinforce again and again this worldview of 2 parallel regimes. And you need to hold on to many lies in order to continue believing that. You need to somehow still believe it's temporary, even though more than half a century has passed, and that half century is the majority of the time that the state of Israel itself has existed. You need to ignore the formal annexation of part of the West Bank and the de facto annexation of all of the other area of the West Bank. You need to ignore the fact that by now, some 700,000 Jewish Israelis, which is some 10% of the Jewish population to the river and the sea, is with significant percentage of people under Israel's control are living over there, quote unquote, in the occupied West Bank, but their lives are somehow conducted as if they're living here on this side of the West Bank. So there's a lot of lies that you somehow need to ignore to continue talking about democracy here and occupation there. But the key lie that you need to continue holding on to is to ignore the fact that there is one overarching principle, which is at the core of the actions of the Israeli regime on both sides of the Green Line everywhere that Israel controls. And that is the principle of advancing and cementing the supremacy of one group of people, Jews, over another group of people, Palestinians, and all that in a situation of basic demographic parity. Half of the 14 million people between the river and the sea under Israel's control are Palestinian, the other half are Jewish individuals like myself, and yet the reality here is structured so that only half of the population will enjoy the full benefits, protections, and rights that the state allows.
Got it. Thank you. Inès, your organization, the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, works to shift discourse and policy with movements and decision makers globally. Do you find that calling out Israel's organized as apartheid is helping Palestinians change the discourse in a helpful way?
Thank you, Rebecca, and I want to thank you for the invitation, and great to be with Hagai today and you all. And also, I want to really acknowledge and thank your approach of recognizing, I think, your own where you live and your own settler colonial past and an identity of your place. I think it's very important for us seeing that as Palestinian, give us hope as well. Yes, I think, look, the Palestinians had not waited for B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch to call the situation as apartheid. Many Palestinian organizations had welcomed the United Nations ESQA report, which is the regional body in West Asia for the UN, and their director had to resign actually at the time because of that report. And many other organizations had already submitted a request at the UN as well in order to investigate apartheid. So yeah, I think the answer is yes. And the second part of the answer, it's not enough, but I think the first part of the answer is definitely yes. Why? Because I think, as Hagai said, especially for Palestinians, there is a framing that has been imposed on us in the past 40 years, which is, the idea of that there is this separation and green line. Actually, it has been imposed since 1948, but really like this idea that this would be a dispute between, one territory on, West Bank and Gaza on one side and East Jerusalem, and then Israel on the other side, and this would be a dispute that should be resolved through bilateral negotiations, and that eventually there would be this separation. And I think that has ingrained, I think, a framework of thinking that is very far from the reality. And for Palestinians, the core of the reality of our identity is going back to 1948, and I think the trauma and the ethnic cleansing and what has happened in 1948, but even before that. So, as the very good new book of Professor Rashid Khalidi is saying, it's 100 years war on Palestine. So we see this as a colonial continuum, I think, of denial of our basic collective rights and also individual political rights since 1917, and basically the Balfour Declaration, which effectively has erased the idea that we have collective national and political rights in our homeland. And obviously after that, there has been milestones in the history of Palestinian resistance and uprising against that colonial ruling, like in 1936 and then in 1948. And then the successive intifadas. And so I think it's to see, I think apartheid allows to see that also in this in that longer term framing. However, as you know, apartheid doesn't include the settler colonial framework. So it doesn't necessarily go with it, because apartheid is defined as a crime against humanity. And effectively, it's about a situation, as Hagai said, of with the intent of maintaining domination of one group over another. But then it doesn't include that settler colonial, I think, approach and history that we have and that we also have to deal with. So I think I would add that aspect, which apartheid is not providing. And I think we need to also reckon with that, but it's not incompatible, obviously. And I think it's not exclusive one of another. And I think the very important thing is that it allows us, I think, to really go back to 1948 instead of thinking that the problem started in 1967. And I think until there is a reckoning with that, I think we won't make much progress. And I think that apartheid is allowing that for Palestinians and to recognize that effectively this intent of domination and of maintaining that domination has been there since 1948. Like, just one example is that, and maybe we'll go into maybe further details later. I'll let you ask further questions.
Good, thank you. I'm sure we'll go into more detail.
Maybe if I can just jump in and continuation of what Inès was saying, just look at the question that you asked about, is this productive, right? And I think that I think two things on this. I think it's both principled and productive. And both of these are extremely important and significant in separate and independent ways. First of all, this is a principled position because we as a human rights organization, we have a commitment to speak truth to ourselves and to the public and eventually to power about our analysis of what is it that we're dealing with. And in that sense, it has nothing to do with the question whether what we have to say is convenient or productive or anything else, right? If we come to a certain conclusion, whatever it is, we have a commitment to be truthful about that. So that's just a principled position, and a human rights organization cannot call itself a human rights organization if it deviates from that principle. So that's the conclusion we arrived at, and this is why we're saying it. It's a principled position. Having said that, I also believe very strongly that it's a productive conclusion. And why is that so? Because obviously, if one has the wrong analysis, you're going to arrive at the wrong conclusions and the wrong remedies and the wrong ways to deal with the injustice that you're facing. So I believe it's both productive and principled, and also absolutely, as Inès was saying, I mean, there's still obviously a long way ahead to go. It's not that, one day some organization said something and, then this injustice somehow evaporated. Far from it. The apartheid and occupation are, alive and kicking, physically kicking and brutalizing Palestinian lives. But I do believe that this is an essential step in the right direction.
Great, thank you. And please do continue to jump in back and forth as you have other input on questions that I'm asking. So I want to get into the report itself, B'Tselem's report. In the report, you identified 4 areas of life in which the Israeli regime enforces Jewish supremacy. You focused on immigration, land, freedom of movement, and political participation. And clearly there are other ways as well, but those are the 4 major ones that you identified. But it also addresses how Israel allows Palestinians a different set of rights within each of the 4 areas that Israel controls: inside the Green Line, inside the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. All of which the report says, and I'm quoting here, are, quote, inferior compared to the rights afforded to Jewish citizens, unquote. And then the report continues a bit later. The goal of Jewish supremacy is advanced differently in every unit, and the resulting forms of injustice differ. The lived experience of Palestinians in blockaded Gaza is unlike that of Palestinian subjects in the West Bank, permanent residents in East Jerusalem, or Palestinian citizens within sovereign Israeli territory. Yet these are the variations on the fact that all Palestinians living under Israeli rule are treated as inferior in rights and status to Jews who live in the very same area. So what would be very helpful is if the two of you could talk about each of these areas of enforced Jewish supremacy, both in terms of the laws, but how this is experienced by Palestinians across those 4 geographic areas.
Go ahead, Hagai.
Inès, you want to begin or you want me to go first?
I think just maybe the framing, and then I can go deeper into the experience.
Okay, will do. Thanks. So yeah, I mean, there's maybe if it's possible to post on the chat to everyone like the link to the report itself, and I do invite people to take the time to read it. It's not a very long report. It's I think 7 pages in print, and that was done on purpose to have like a short, concise, and like to the point, ready for public consumption analysis. And if that's too long, then you also find on the website a short illustrated explainer that in just over 1,000 words gives you the essence of the report.
We will send this out, Hagai. We will send this out to everybody who's registered, a link to all of these things.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so please do avail yourself of these resources. And obviously there's also the Human Rights Watch report and reports by Palestinian organizations, and these are definitely more detailed and give a longer analysis, and in some cases a deeper legal analysis. But again, what we wanted to do is write something that anyone can understand and relate to, because we think that reality is like self-evident in all of these ways. It's important to be spelled out in this fashion. And then there are, I mean, there are like many aspects we could focus on, but like quickly into the point of this question. So what indeed is this different measures of oppression that Israel applies over Palestinians, right? And that's a nuance in the analysis that needs to be spelled out, because obviously we want to be accurate, and the level of oppression is different. So if you are a Palestinian living under Israel's rule, somewhere between the river and the sea, then you will suffer a certain degree of oppression. But there's nowhere in which what the protections that you will get would be equal to those of a Jewish person. So for a Jewish person, doesn't matter where that individual lives, the river and the sea, they will enjoy the full rights, protections, privileges that the state provides inside Israel proper, in the only part of the West Bank that has been formally annexed, aka East Jerusalem, or anywhere else in the occupied West Bank. While for a Palestinian, you can have different shades, and there are a number of options, right? So you can be like a second-class citizen if you're one of the 1.7 million Palestinians that are citizens inside the Green Line, or maybe a third-class permanent resident. That's the status that Israel allocated to Palestinians in East Jerusalem, or if you're a Palestinian in the rest of the West Bank, or if you're one of the 2 million Palestinians that live in the blockaded Gaza Strip, right? So for the 7 million Jews between the river and the sea, one status with full rights for all of the Jewish individuals in this area. And for the other half of the population, different levels of oppression, but nowhere providing a Palestinian person with the same sets of rights protections that the Jewish person can have. So that's extremely important to understand, because obviously the lack of nuance in the analysis is one of the ways that Israeli propaganda often desires either to undermine someone's analysis of the reality, or to apply some form of whataboutism on this. So, why are you talking about, Gaza, but inside Israel, they're citizens, and so on, right? So yeah, we're not ignoring the citizens, nor are we ignoring the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. We're just doing the obvious thing, which is analyzing the realities for all of the people that live under the control of this regime, which means everyone between the river and the sea, in the ways that are relevant either to their experience as Jews or their experience as Palestinians. So different shades of oppression. And then there's the analysis of how this is applied in some of the key ways that are essential for this project to be applied. So two of these apply, if you will, equally in terms of the oppression on Palestinians between the river and the sea, and two have more divergence on the Green Line. So the two that apply against all Palestinians in very similar fashion is with regard to the re-engineering of space and the re-engineering of demography, right? So I'm talking about land, and I'm talking about population and immigration. So if you look at land between the river and the sea, land that has been under Israel's control since 1948 inside Israel proper, and since 1967 also in the occupied territories. So if you look at land, you will see that what happens to land is the same thing everywhere under Israel's control. Land that used to be Palestinian is taken over by the state and then is allocated for the development of towns, communities, infrastructure to serve these towns and communities for the Jewish population, right? So we did it since 48 to Palestinian land inside Israel, and we continue doing that since 67 in the new areas that Israel has obtained control of. And Israel has insisted through and through, both of all of these areas, that this is what's done legally, right? And that's another point that it's essential for us to emphasize, just like the careful Israeli attention on not just doing it, but providing a guise of legality to these policies against Palestinians. So this wasn't done in some rouge fashion. This is done according to law, quote unquote, and governmental policies that have been applied consistently in different areas. And it's interesting to notice how sometimes it would be like the very same mechanisms. For instance, the usage of military training zones to take over land from Palestinians, and then either just to prevent it from the original Palestinian owners or to reallocate it later for Jewish development. That mechanism has been used on both sides of the Green Line, the very same mechanism. And in other places, there are different mechanisms, but all in all, same trajectory, right? Of that destiny of land between the river and the sea from the perspective of the state. And we could talk much more maybe later in the Q&A about this aspect. It's such a major aspect of control and domination and supremacy and oppression of Palestinians. And then there's the other essential aspect, which is the re-engineering of demography, right? And again, everywhere between the river and the sea, you see the same thing. For Jewish individuals, you can come and almost immediately, almost automatically, have a full status as a citizen. It doesn't matter where you arrive at, whether you immigrate into Israel proper and you want to live in Tel Aviv, or if you immigrate to a settlement in the West Bank, right? Whether it's one of the settlement neighborhoods in East Jerusalem or a city settlement like Ariel or one of the outposts somewhere else in the West Bank, it doesn't matter. If you're a Jewish person, you can come anywhere between the river and the sea. The state desires that, the state supports that, and it's open for everyone. For Palestinians, it's exactly the opposite picture, right? And it's important that people appreciate that it's not just quote unquote, that Israel almost completely prevents the ability from Palestinians from gaining status inside Israel. It's also with regard to the West Bank and Gaza, right? Like this reality, because Israel has full control over the envelope, right? Over the external borders, then Israel has the ability to decide who goes in and who doesn't, right? And again, not just into the Green Line, but to the entire area. And Israel has been meticulous in its focus on not allowing Palestinians almost completely to gain status anywhere between the river and the sea. And that applies also to Palestinians who have been made refugees in 1948 or their descendants, or Palestinians that have been made refugees in 1967, to the additional several 100,000 of Palestinians that became refugees after the 1967 war. So again, one vector for Jewish individuals and exactly the opposite vector for Palestinians. So re-engineering space, re-engineering demography. And then with regard to political rights, you can see a more sharp division on the green line, from the almost complete denial of political rights from Palestinians in the occupied territories to political rights, some political rights that Palestinian citizens do have, right? They can vote for parliament, they can be voted. So there is a difference in that sense, obviously. Again, goes back to what I was saying before in the beginning about the different levels of oppression that different categories of Palestinians suffer from Israel's hands. But it doesn't mean, again, going back to what I said in the beginning, that with that Palestinian citizens are made equal to Jewish citizens. They're not, right? And obviously political rights are not limited only to the right to vote. They also depend on the ability to protest, political speech, and the effectiveness of your political speech and of your voting. And then the fourth aspect, which you mentioned, which is freedom of movement. And again, there's more of a distinction on the green line. Palestinian citizens will have more freedom of movement, more comparable to Jewish citizens, but obviously horrific limits on freedom of movement. It's almost ironic to call it freedom of movement, but like denial of the freedom of movement on Palestinians in the rest of the occupied territories, with the worst situation being imposed on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, which is the reason why it is often referred to as the largest open-air prison on the planet, with Israel has made it almost virtually impossible for anyone to leave the blockaded strip.
Great. I mean, not great, but thank you. So Inès, this is like a lot of different areas that the report identifies and that Hagai has just mentioned. Do you want to pick out a few of these that you feel you can help people get a sense of the reality on the ground for people because of these enforced differentiations, apartheid differentiations?
Yeah, I'll start personal, and then I'll go into other examples that I think are important. So just consider them among the very privileged already. But the situation Hagai described is also like directly affecting my family and my husband's family. So, for example, my grandparents, they fled in 1948, they were expelled. Which means my grandparents could never come back to visit, right? So then my dad became a French citizen, naturalized citizen. So like many American Palestinian have the same, I'm just French Palestinian, but there's many American Palestinian in that same situation. So I cannot be there as a Palestinian. I'm there as a French person, and I'm still like juggling with like visas and I can now enter, but then obviously I have an international profile, so I could get an international job, but not a lot of people can do that. So first, that's one thing, is that my family, they could never visit, they could never come back, and I'm not allowed to be there as a Palestinian. Second is my husband, who's a Palestinian citizen of Israel. So our village was destroyed, completely destroyed, and my family fled to Lebanon. His family, their village was also expelled, but they fled to another village nearby that wasn't destroyed. And in fact, they could never retrieve their village. Their village now is an archaeological park where obviously the presence of a Palestinian village has been almost erased. And they are considered, it's called present absentees. So they are considered absentees. They were internally displaced, internal refugees, and they could never retrieve their land. And this went to the state of Israel. And with that, for example, his grandmother, they lost some agricultural land with like prunes, and his grandmother, her whole life, she had to work in an Israeli factory, putting prunes in bags from her own land that was stolen, and then became an Israeli company. So this is the kind of situation where it's fundamentally, obviously unjust and absurd. And the other side of this is obviously the other myriad of problems in family reunification. That means if you're a Palestinian, you cannot love or marry who you want, because that means, obviously risking being illegal and facing a lot of hurdles. So if you like, now, we're married, I'm a French citizen, which means as a non-Jew, but as a European, I have the right to ask for being a resident in Israel. But if I would be from the West Bank, this is not allowed, which means if a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and there is thousands of cases, are in love and get married with a Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza, these people, a lot of them actually live within Israel proper, on the other side of the Green Line, illegally, means they don't have any social security services. So you have mothers who give birth without any support or any security. They are basically illegal, like illegal immigrants, and they have to hide, and they sometimes don't go out of the house or their village or their small community, because otherwise they would be, put back in the West Bank. So this is thousands of families who cannot be together just because eventually, if you're not Jewish, you don't have the rights effectively to be in Israel. And inside the West Bank, you also have a lot of these cases because, as Hagai said, the population registry is still very much controlled by Israel and not by the Palestinians. So obviously this creates like, a lot of these situations. And, another example of that, I think a very easy way to understand things is also about mobility. So I think Israel has created this very sophisticated systems in order somehow to control, and I think maintain that control. You create this bureaucracy that's like really a Kafkaean bureaucracy, where if you're a Palestinian and you want to go study, sometimes you have to go behind, like you have to go all around the wall. If you're like on one side of East Jerusalem and you want to get on the other side of East Jerusalem, then you have the wall, you have to go all around. You need a permit to go and work. If you want to go work in Jerusalem and you're in the West Bank, you need a permit. So all the permits regime, the checkpoints, all the administration, it's meant to also drown you into being subjugated to all these humiliations. I think the Palestinians, they are born with basically their everyday life feeling that they're just a demographic or a security threat. They're not considered human beings, they're considered as a demographic or a security threat. So, and that's very ingrained in every part of what you go through within your life, whether it's birth or then going to school and then going to university and getting married and, having a livelihood. So yeah, I think I think it has created that multiple layers of hurdles, humiliations, and we haven't spoken obviously about effectively just the overall destruction of the land and the livelihood. So the destruction of the agriculture sector, the lack of access to water, and the lack of basically like the proper destruction of the Palestinian economy and culture in order to kind of also maintain that domination. Because in order to maintain the domination, you also need that the other to need you, right? And so I think Palestinians today are fully dependent on Israel's economy, on Israel's imports, on Israel's control. So it maintains that sense and that status of full dependence and control.
Inés, I want to thank you for sharing that, and also to say that it's, I feel that it's like one of the failures, the often failures of the language of human rights, that it's, it's just somehow sometimes too theoretical, too formal, too legal. And, if you don't have like, a degree in human rights, then you can't have like a valid opinion on, and it's too complicated. How can you even talk about it or understand it with all of its complexity? And it creates this gap between, maybe stuff that is litigated somewhere by some experts and what is actually happening to the lives of individuals and families and communities and an entire people that is facing the brutality of this oppression and the very real price that it takes in terms of dignity and humanity from millions of people day in and day out over decade after decade after decade. And really like the way it comes with the air in that sense, again, if you're a Jewish person, that basically that you're desired, and if you're a Palestinian person, that you're undesired, with all of the consequences that has all of the time in different facets of your life if you're a Palestinian dealing with this regime.
Thank you, both of you, for that deep response to that broad question. So we're having quite a few questions come in. If you have any questions, if folks have questions that they want asked, please post them in the Q&A. We've already got a good number of them that we will start asking. But if you have other questions that you want asked, please post them and Janet will get them, and we will take as many as we can with Inès and Hagai. So the first question that we got was, could you talk about the nation state law and its place in the apartheid structure and in daily life for Palestinians? And either of you can take this, or both of you, whoever wants to talk about it.
Maybe that's one.
Me? Okay. So like the passage of this basic law a few years ago is a significant moment. It's a significant moment, but it's a significant moment less in the sense of policy and more in the sense of, I would call it maybe coming out. Because it's not that Israel didn't have, as we've been talking on, throughout this webinar, didn't have, policy-based discrimination against Palestinians in all walks of life since 1948. We had, right? We did it for 7 decades without the need for a nation-state law. Did it and got away with it, both in terms of the Israeli courts allowing for this and in terms of the international community still somehow accepting this as, being compliant with Israel being perceived as a liberal democracy, right? So like, and all that, like, what we've described, and specifically also the theft of Palestinian land and the immigration policies and other discriminatory policies, all of that in the absence of the nation state law, no problem, right? What happened in 2018 when the nation state law was passed was elevating this pre-existing reality into a constitutional principle, right? And that's why I'm calling it a coming out moment. Because like we keep saying apartheid, and we didn't spend time so far like in making distinction between South Africa and like the historical analogy and apartheid, the political, intellectual, and legal analysis of a reality. And obviously both of these are relevant, but it's important to say, as as people have been commenting for a long time, that one describes the reality, Israel's regime as apartheid, it doesn't mean that one is saying it's identical to what whites have done to blacks in apartheid South Africa. There are differences. By the way, there's always differences between historical analogies. History doesn't never repeat itself exactly in the same fashion. But since the defeat of apartheid in South Africa, apartheid became an independent term, regardless of that history, that simply relates to a reality of group supremacy, domination, oppression of one part of the population over another in all of the ways that we've described. And for instance, the fact that, in South Africa, it was based on race, and in Israel, Palestine, it's based on an ethno-national distinction, it doesn't make any difference for the core of for the principle to be the same principle, and hence for the principle to apply in the same way from an analytical perspective. And that's why apartheid is indeed the correct analysis, the differences withstanding. But there are also other differences, and one of them is that apartheid South Africa was, if you will, naive enough to openly proclaim itself as such. By the way, interestingly, since 1948, right? While Israel, the official propaganda line is, how dare you call us, apartheid? We're not just a democracy, we're the only democracy in the Middle East. And if you're, calling Israel apartheid, then you must be an anti-Semite or a terrorist, and so on. And the fact that, South Africa proclaimed itself as such, and Israel does not, again, that's one of the differences, but it doesn't matter for a situation to apply as apartheid, obviously. What matters is reality. What matters is the policies themselves and the way the regime acts. The fact that it admits that it is such, or proclaims it as such, or denies it, matters not. What matters is what that regime does. But it's interesting to notice that the gap between what Israel does and what Israel says, what Israel does, apartheid, what Israel says, liberal democracy plus temporary, occupation, those, frames of propaganda, that gap seemed to be narrowing in recent years. And the nation-state law is an expression of that, of elevating policies that have been in place for 7 decades. And suddenly taking them out of the closet and putting them in, a basic law in what's basically a chapter of, Israel's future full constitution. So that's an important point. I'll just say that also that, in recent months, since this new, more, if you will, soft-spoken government has been sworn in Jerusalem, then maybe that gap, well, at least Israel is trying to reopen that gap, to re-expand it between the propaganda, well-behaved, more sweet-talking government, while the same policies actually continue. But one way or another, whether from what Israel does, it's more sincere about its apartheid policies, or less sincere and applies more propaganda, again, for all of us, it shouldn't matter at all. What we should do is look through the propaganda, examine the facts, examine the realities, and see it for what it is, apartheid.
Thank you. Inès, did you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to say that in practice for Palestinians, most Palestinians, it didn't change much or anything really. But I would say that for Palestinian citizens of Israel, I think it just reopened. I think it just changed, and kind of reaffirmed that they were basically, this is not a state for them. Like the constitution and the state and its institutions are not made for Palestinians, and it was made clear in that law again. So, and what we've seen is that, I think a little known fact is that the Palestinian citizens of Israel, they were under a military ruling from 1948 to 1966. So effectively, the exception, military regime that's now the occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, was there for the Palestinian citizens of Israel until 66. And then there was this period of really Israel tried very hard in this assimilation and trying to convince the Palestinian citizens that, they eventually had a space and they could be so much more thankful than, the Palestinians, and dividing, also creating those divide, right? Divide and conquer. And so trying to show the Palestinian citizens of Israel that they were not under occupation. But then obviously this law just reminded them again. And there has been obviously several instances where they're just, again, reminded of being that, citizens with less rights. And I think, the uprisings and what happened, especially in Palestinian cities in Haifa, Lid, Jaffa in the month of May, I think is also a result, I think, of some of these evolutions and that have really raised again the frustrations and injustice to the front.
Thank you. Inez, this question is for you. There have been a number of people sending in questions asking about water shortages, and it's, I think, because part of the activism that we're involved in here has focused quite a bit on water shortage and the destruction of the water filtration plants, et cetera. But a number of people actually have asked, is there really a water shortage, or is it simply that Israel controls its distribution? And then what prevents Palestinians in the West Bank from digging their own wells if Israel is trying to control the waters that they have, that they are controlling?
Yeah, so the answer is definitely more that Israel controls the sources, the renewable sources of water, rather than an effective shortage, although climate change is a reality, and effectively we're in a water-stressed region overall, but it's a very political issue. So so effectively the renewable water sources are mainly an aquifer underneath effectively most of the West Bank, and an aquifer underneath Gaza that has been completely, they're both over pumped. But what happens is that the Oslo agreements, which were terrible agreements, and the Palestinians signed effectively terrible agreements, in that Israel controls 80% of the water and left 20% back to the Palestinians. And that also meant transferring an actual amount, a specific amount of cubic meters instead of a proportion. And that hasn't changed since 95. And so with that, it means that Palestinians, they can build water infrastructure in Area A. So as you know, the Oslo Accords, they also unfortunately divided, in order to maintain the status quo at the time of existing settlements and control of the land, they divided in 3 zones, A, B, and C. And so it created that cheese, that Swiss cheese that you see, that effectively created that reality we're in. And Israel remains in full control of 61% of the West Bank, which means that there Palestinians cannot build infrastructure. And specifically for water, again, the Israelis in the negotiations, they said, basically anything that the Palestinians do after we sign those agreements need to go through Israeli approval. So it has to be joint. There was a joint commission. And obviously, more than 90% of any water projects and infrastructure that were presented by Palestinians were rejected, which means that today, effectively, Palestinians have 1 day of running water a week, and the settlements have 7 days of running water a week. And digging wells requires land, and requires land where you can dig wells, and that land is controlled by the Israelis and is used for the benefit of the settlers. And so if you see, and for those who've been visiting, or if you visit, you can clearly differentiate a Palestinian town from a settlement or from an Israeli town, even on just when the green line is, because Palestinian houses all have big water tanks on the roofs. This is like, that means because there is no running water, so Palestinians have to but store water for the days to come. So every single Palestinian house has at least like a few big water plastic tanks on the roof, which the Israelis don't need to have. So it's a critical issue, and unfortunately, this has also been transformed as a technical issue by the development peace agenda, the economic peace agenda. So every time you see proposals of improving Palestinian lives or concrete measures, all of this is basically just to maintain Israel's control, and for Palestinians to be dependent on that control and get some breadcrumbs so that they are pacified and don't claim their rights, which is the latest case that we have seen. I'm on electricity. on 3G, but also on like pyramids, etc.
Got it. Thank you very much. A number of questions have come in about the effect of defining Israel-Palestine as an apartheid state. And the questions have to do with what the implications are of that legally. Does it obligate certain behaviors, responses, or restrictions by the global community? Is there anything from the international courts? Is there anything at all that by defining it as apartheid, it rolls out and has implications for Israel?
I hope we'll both take it. I'll begin, and I hope, Inès, that you will continue. So obviously, first, it does, right? Like apartheid is, a crime in international law, and there are specific legal consequences. There definitely should be. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that kind of accountability yet. Instead, what we're seeing is impunity, and that is in itself not new, right? Because even if you go back to just like analyzing Israeli legal obligations under international law in the context of belligerent temporary occupation, right? What Israel proclaims that is the relevant legal framework, then even in that framework, there are Israeli war crimes that Israel has been successful in getting away with impunity, right? So, yeah, whatever frame you apply, I mean, maybe it wouldn't surprise people, right? International law is there in order to protect human rights, and obviously Israel is committing, gross human rights violations, in broad daylight. This is one of the most documented injustices on the planet, and from Israel's perspective, one of the most successful accomplishments of this regime isn't just like, doing it to the subjugated Palestinians, but getting away with it and being considered a democracy throughout the years, right? With a sense of impunity, before it was named apartheid, after it was named apartheid, under, that legal frame, under this legal frame. Like that, this is where we are. Israel violates international humanitarian law. Israel violates, human rights law, and gets away with it. But in a way, what I was really trying to get to is the moral principle before the legal principle, because as I've said, the law has so far failed protecting the rights of Palestinians under new or old, whatever legal framework that has been used. Impunity is the name of the game from Israel's perspective. So the law has failed us, and that's because one of the the weakest aspect of the national law is the lack of enforcement mechanisms. But it doesn't mean that the international community doesn't have an obligation, and it doesn't mean that the international community doesn't have leverage. It has both, and it is a political decision not to use that leverage, right? And this is where part of like our hope about reframing reality in terms of the international discourse as what it is, as apartheid, will close that gap. Because with that in mind, what we hope is that more people will wake up to the injustice, and then from a moral obligation, and again without having to be like a legal expert, because I'm sure everyone can just like naturally recognize as as human beings an injustice when they see one, and recognizing this injustice done against Palestinians, to demand that the foreign policy of your country will in no way benefit or support these kind of Israeli actions against Palestinians. Right, so like align foreign policy with a genuine commitment to human rights as a moral obligation. That the most basic thing that you would want to demand from your own government is that would not be complicit in these crimes.
Did you want to add anything, Inès, to that? No.
No, I very much agree. And again, it's not a problem of legal obligations. The legal obligations of third states are there. It's really a matter of political will and political courage that's not there.
Mhm. Okay. Another question says, the report refers to Jewish supremacy, but it stops short of saying the concept of an exclusively Jewish political nation state is the major driving force behind this reality. Isn't it important to name this as well?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question fully, so I apologize for my limitations. I think it's, it's very clear, and it's like stated in the report, and we discuss it, I think, mostly like in the context of political rights. And I guess like in that sense, you can maybe do like the cost benefit analysis from like a Jewish supremacy perspective of having a minority of the oppressed population, a fragment of it, right, as citizens with political rights. And the cost of that is that they're less oppressed. The benefit of that is that marketing one's country as a democracy, thanks to allowing for that fragment of the occupied, oppressed people to have those kind of political representation and voting rights, gives you a lot of cachet, like in that liberal democracy propaganda marketing, right? And we could spend an hour just like on the aspect of I was trying to get it before, I just say it now quickly without taking an hour, that like we already talked about like the impunity and so on, but it's essential, like from Israel's perspective, like this is essential, like for the success of this project, right? It's not just that we're able to steal the land and re-engineer demography and so on. We're doing all that in a very skilled fashion. But the other leg that makes this project so successful from like Israel's perspective is that we're getting away with it, right? Like just think how much of the discourse is about Israel as a democracy and so on. Like like who talked about like South Africa as such. And yeah, like whites in South Africa did, vote, right? And I'm sure they insisted that it was like a democracy. But like, did anyone, think of like, I don't know, it was like what, 85% versus 15%? Like, who would think that, it's a place where like 15% of the population has voting rights, is can call itself a democracy, right? It's outrageous to even like try and make that claim. So in Israel Palestine, it's not it's not 90-10, it's not 15-85, it's 50-50. It's demographic parity, but half of the people are suffering in all of the many ways that we've discussed today, and yet this propaganda run by Israel is successful, isn't just dismissed immediately, right? It's like, how can you say you're a democracy? Like by definition, inherently, this is a deeply undemocratic reality. And it's essential for Israel to, maintain this facade, and to succeed in that, there are various efforts. And one of them is, the marketing is, voting rights and liberal democracy. The other one, I mentioned that briefly before, is that, insistence on a guise of legality, that this isn't just like happening in some haphazard fashion, and there's legal scrutiny, and there's the high court, and there are basic laws, and there are legal remedies, and so on. So like, don't worry about it. Like, this is a well-functioning, independent judicial system that just happens to whitewash and greenlight these crimes against Palestinians and these policies through in and throughout. And there are other mechanisms that try to camouflage. It's not a random thing. And so far it's been quite successful, unfortunately.
Thank you. Inès, did you want to add anything to that?
I want to jump on here to answer another question that I've seen that is related about the two-state solution. I think there's in the question, I think there is a reverse understanding of who's actually pretending to that facade, and the lip service to the two-state solution that still exists. So for Israel, actually, it's very convenient that we keep paying lip service to the two-state solution or some form of process or bilateral negotiations, and because eventually it means that the Israelis can continue to entrench apartheid and colonization, etc., while paying lip service to the two-state solution, because they know they will get away with it. When the Palestinians, in fact, have accepted that solution. So it is not that the Palestinians have not accepted the solution and the Israelis think that the Palestinians eventually will not agree, is that effectively the Palestinians, they made that compromise. The two-state solution was very much an accepted compromise by the Palestinians that effectively, so they refused in 1948 the separation. Basically, they were taking their lands and the Palestinians said, no, why are you taking like more than half of our lands? And then they accepted in 1988 and said, fine, we'll accept sovereignty only in 22% of historic Palestine. And then they signed Oslo. And in Oslo, there was this exchange of letter. And in fact, the Palestinians very much recognized Israel in the 67 borders, which for those who are interested in international law, were the basis for all this was Resolution 242 after the 67 war. And the Israelis didn't. The Israelis left it open. They said, we are open to some negotiations with the PLO. We'll recognize the PLO, but not Palestine and not the two-state solution. We'll open negotiations with the PLO and we'll see. And I think since then, this has been the strategy. We'll see. We'll keep the process open. We'll work on time. And eventually, it's very convenient to keep that framing because they could see that the international community is very much like, we want to state, and the Palestinians are like, we want a state. And in fact, Israel is like, oh, yes, yes, yes. But, in time, when negotiations can come, when it will be the right time. And in the meantime, advancing more and more, getting more territory and enclosing Palestinians in Bantustans or blockading Gaza, So I think it has been a very successful game, which actually would be very detrimental for the Israeli model if the Palestinian leadership and also the international community recognizes that there is a one state of apartheid and that effectively we should think of an alternative model, whether it's a one state or a confederation or some form of federal state. I mean, again, the options are open, but at least it would break this idea that there is a state that is an ethno-national state with Jewish supremacy.
So this leads perfectly into another question that came through, and someone said, please speak about the one-state solution and its various possible manifestations and how you view the likelihood of this solution being recognized and implemented. And this is, again, something that those of us in the activist community have been exposed to, with people from Israel and Palestine coming here and talking about their notions of how they think this could pan out, how it could work out. So it would be very interesting to hear the two of your perspective on this as a viable option.
So maybe I'll jump in, and I apologize if I won't satisfy the audience with the following answer, but hear me out. So we have no position on the correct number of states that need to be between the river and the sea. And I understand why people are, compelled to talk about this solution, and that it's often whether, we're talking about two states or one state, and so on. But, continuing what Inès was describing, that, to just ask the question, who is this benefiting, right? I don't know what the solution is going to be. If I go back to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I don't find there the answer as to what's the correct number of states. What I do find there is that everyone needs to have full rights. Everyone needs to have equality. And when I say full rights, I also mean collective rights and self-determination, right? That I find there. And that's the principle that we believe in, and that's what we insist on, right? Now, that may be realized through, different political models, right? They've been mentioned in the question, they've been mentioned in some of the future trajectories when, Inés was speaking just a few minutes ago. These are all options. And as a human rights organization, there is no priority from our perspective for one model over another, right? We're not a political party, we're not a movement. We don't take a position on this issue. As long as it's an outcome that the 14 million people here desire, and that it is an outcome that will provide full rights, and again, as I've said, also collective rights and self-determination for everyone, then we would be satisfied. And I think that needs to be looked at compared to reality, right? And what we are facing now, because when people are talking about the solution, then often they kind of postpone their judgment or their actions into a future. And what we're saying is that, yeah, dragging negotiations over whatever solution, whether it's in good faith or bad faith, and so on, is one of the most successful Israeli techniques of, again, getting away with it, right? Because we would be negotiating, so don't pressure us, and so on. While since the dawn of Oslo, we've used the time very well, right? It's not that the situation has been frozen in any shape or form. People often talk about a status quo. The situation is never static. Israel has more than tripled the number of settlers, right, since the happy, not so happy mid 90s. We've used the time very well, and in that sense, our recommendation, our ask would be for people to park the solution and insist on looking at reality, which people are paying the price for that reality, in life and dignity, day in and day out, and act against that reality, right? Without having a commitment to a specific solution. Again, as long as it articulates the principles that have to be realized looking forward, because otherwise. And if you take, for instance, the current Israeli government versus the previous one, and just think about what I was saying before about closing the gap between pretense and sincerity, right? So up to a few months ago, under Netanyahu, you've gradually had a government that, in Israeli leadership, that was paying so much less lip service to two-state solution and negotiations. It was more frank, more open, more sincere in saying, Israel will retain full control over the entire area. There will never be a Palestinian state. Not a single settlement will be removed. And, and Israel itself is not a state of all of its citizens, right? And all of these things being said in recent years. And that has been more sincere. And that, I think, helped people around the world to wake up to the actual reality of what's happening here. And if the Israeli leadership itself is saying, we will retain full control and we won't give millions of Palestinians political rights, that's apartheid. And now compare that to the government that we now have for just a few months, right? And ignore for a second, Bennett's past as a settler leader and so on, and think about the bright, new, digestible, liberal face of the Israeli government. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid. He's happy to talk once again about, quote unquote, two-state solution. But on the ground, the policies are the same policies. Settlements are being expanded, Palestinian homes are being demolished, impunity for settlers and soldiers that kill or hurt Palestinians day in and day out. The blockade on Gaza is continuing, and everything else is continuing, right? So the gap is widening. Again, the marketing of let's go back to negotiations, right, is back there. But again, see through it, insist on the facts, and respond to them.
Yeah, I mean, I very much subscribe to that. We should move away from a solution which is for Palestinian and Israelis and the population there, and also Palestinian refugees to decide. But for that, you need to create the conditions for how can you allow self-determination? How can you allow to shift the power dynamics? and this asymmetry that exists. So I think it's, how do you get there in order for the populations who are directly concerned to decide and to build a solution? And I think this is what we all need to work on, is creating that possibility. And you know, there is a lot in the Palestinian circles also now, like this idea of radical imagination. Like we need to radically imagine a new future. Like the place we live in, like between the river and the sea, we might invent, you know, even a new model, because obviously the nation states that kind of the West and Europe and, you know, has been living on and has basically dominated the whole world since the 15th century, you know, and let's say even more prominently since the 19th century. This is a model that might not work in our space. And I think it's, you know, when you think about things like just 100 years ago, like in 1920, you could take the train from Nablus to Cairo on a journey, you know, and stopping in Jaffa, and like, so nothing is, I think nothing is irreversible. Things are reversible, things can change. And right now we're in a configuration where there are facts on the ground and things imposed on us, and we're told to be pragmatic, realistic, in order just to conform to what's convenient to those who want to dominate. And I think this is what we need to push back against, is the ability to reverse things and to change things, which I think we should not give up on, even if like the wave is obviously, unfortunately, going against, you know, I mean, obviously is going in the majority direction, in those that control, rather than those that are want to change things for the marginalized.
You both have used the phrase "from the river to the sea" a lot. And in this country, when we use the phrase as activists, "from the river to the sea," we get a lot of pushback as this being some radical notion that is somehow threatening Israelis and Jewish well-being. And my guess from what you have said is that you're using the phrase as simply a recognition that life, that apartheid, that the way that the world functions there, from the river to the sea, is really something that has to be addressed as a whole, rather than departmentalizing different pieces of it. But I would really like to know, what has the phrase "from the river to the sea" meant in terms of your own activism in Israel and Palestine?
You want to begin? You want?
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is, for me, it's a matter of describing the geographic the geographic reality of what is the territory we're talking about. So I can call it historic Palestine, but that can also be attacked as you're like denying Israel. In any cases, I think it's about, where are you talking about? And in fact, it's the territory between the river and the sea. Mm-hmm. So I think you, like, I don't know, from being in Palestine and talking to an external audience, I've never felt this was attacked. I think I could see our comrades in America, like American Palestinians, etc., being attacked. And I think it's really just more when it's taken just out of context, just changed, and also really as taken as a term. I don't think there is even a major concept there. It's just to describe a reality, a geographic reality, so that effectively Palestinian identity exists anyway, and in the whole territory. You know, it doesn't, there is no green line in like the Palestinian identity and collective exists there between the river and the sea. That doesn't mean it's not anti-Semitic. It's just to describe the geographic reality that we're in, both with Jewish people and Palestinians.
First, I think it's like, you know, interesting, you know, the way the word radical is used, and like, you know, what's extreme and what's moderate and so on, right? So I think it's extreme like, to hold 2 million people like in a blockade for 15 years. I think that's extreme. I think that, dropping, half a ton bombs in the middle of like, crowded neighborhoods, I think that's extreme, right? I think that, maintaining this like an organized whitewash so that like, Israeli security forces, when they kill Palestinians, they know that, almost 100% of the time, they'll get away with like nothing, not even a slap on the wrist. I think that's extreme. I think that, the way we use water to oppress Palestinians, that's extreme. I think, the violence that is, backed by the state in South Hebron, in the Jordan Valley, I think that's extreme. I think having a planning regime that issues, demolition orders to like, one group of people and building permits to another group of people, I think that's extreme, right? So like, I'm really like, it's not like in your language, in your question, but I'm fed up about, people being like, so polite about a reality, which is like just so disgraceful and unjust and lethal, right? And oppressive and totalitarian, right? I think that, using administrative detention against minors, I think that's extreme. I think that holding, bodies of, killed people, like, I think that's extreme. There's a lot of extreme that is going on. But that's somehow, that's just, that should be put aside. But the language that is being used to, describe reality, oh my God, right? Like that needs to be manicured. Like, in a way that like the bulldozers are not supposed to be manicured, right? Nor the F-16s, nor the plan, nor the permit regime, nor the wall that, is built, and all of those things. So I have less and less patience for that. And also, it's like, who's allowed to talk about, from the river to the sea? Because, it's Israeli policy, right? It's Israeli policy to maintain full Israeli control between the river and the sea, right? And the idea, and by the way, this is not like a Netanyahu-Trump, like, novelty, right? The Labor Party that, built the first settlements right after 1967 has been talking about, like, officially, like their plan since, the late 60s, early 70s, is like to keep the Jordan Valley under Israel's control forever, right? Between the river, the Jordan River, and the sea, right? So it's fine for like, Jews to talk about that. And that somehow is not racist, does not erase Palestinians. It's just policy. And at the same time, it's a policy that can be denied, right? Because negotiations and two-state solution and so on. So no, I don't accept that. There is a one-state reality. That one-state reality exists between the river and the sea. And in this one-state reality, there is one regime, the Israeli regime, and that regime is an apartheid regime.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I want to jump on that. I think Hagai touches upon something that's it's just so exhausting as Palestinians that, we have to constantly prove our humanity. It's like, not only are we like facing violence every day and like, but we have to kind of, politely kind of justify why we're human beings that deserve rights. And it's really just a double pain. Like it's really exhausting. And I think the strategy to that or the need is really just to be more and more unapologetic and say, you don't have to first speak for me and Palestinians can speak for themselves. And second, like, you don't like it, well, too bad for you, but just come and see, what it is, or just like, this is a reality. I'm just describing a reality and I will say it as it is. And it's uncomfortable, but it's, as Hagai said, I think it's high time that the internationals and the Israelis feel uncomfortable. And people don't like that, when you can feel like, ooh, they're like, ooh, I'm uncomfortable. Well, good for you. Like, I think good for us. That's how it should be.
Thank you. Thank you. We're gonna stop the Q&A right now because we've got 6 minutes before this ends and we have work to do. Besides listening and learning, which is an important part of the work we do here in the US and in international places, learning about what's going on. But, and Hagai and Inès have just done an exceptional job in helping us get a better understanding of the conditions in Israel-Palestine. But what we would like to ask of those of you who are here on the webinar and those that you are connected with is that you take a few minutes of your time to take action on something that can help dismantle the apartheid conditions that exist and that we've just been hearing about. As most of you well know, the US is the primary enabler, funder, and supporter of the Israeli regime and its military, providing $3.8 billion a year in military support, and the political backing for much of the conditions that we have just heard described. So US Representative Betty McCollum is sponsoring Bill HR 2590, and the name of the bill, it's kind of long, it's Defending the Human Rights of Palestinian Children and Families Living Under Israeli Military Occupation Act. So this bill advocates for promoting and protecting Palestinian human rights and ensuring that US taxpayer funds are not used by the Israeli government or by the government of Israel to support the military detention of Palestinian children, the unlawful seizure, appropriation, and destruction of Palestinian property, and forcible transfer of civilians in the West Bank, or further annexation of Palestinian land in violation of international law. It is important for us to thank the co-sponsors of the bill and encourage those who have not signed on to become co-sponsors. So as a follow-up to this webinar, we are going to send all of the registrants an email with a see if your representative co-sponsor or not. Please commit to taking the few minutes that it's going to take to find out where your representative stands on this critical bill, and then let them hear from you. Hagai and Inès, thank you so much for taking your time this late in the evening for you and for giving us this much of your time after all of the work that you are already doing to help us better understand what's going on and keep us grounded in what we need to be doing. Please know that we will continue to do our work on this end and do what we can to support all of the work you're doing to end the injustices you've been talking about. And to everybody who's listening, thank you for joining us on this webinar. Thank you for taking the time to listen, to read, to engage on this issue. As I said, we're going to send you out, everyone out, a link to the recording of the webinar, links to the documents that Hagai had mentioned, both the Human Rights Watch report as well as the B'Tselem report. And we will send you as well information about House Bill 2590 and how to effectively make your voice heard about it. So on behalf of the Committee for a Just Peace in Israel and Palestine, I thank all of you for being with us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.